And the ecosystem also, the information ecosystem rested in a way, at least parts of it, on local. Is there a crime crisis in the United States? Like, well, I don't know. Like, you got to ask somebody who's covering crime in Indianapolis, and there are fewer people of that than there were. And you're left with Washington politicians yelling about it.
I'm Bethany McLean.
Did you ever have a moment of doubt about capitalism and whether greed's a good idea?
And I'm Luigi Zingales.
We have socialism for the very rich, rugged individualism for the poor.
And this is Capital Isn't, a podcast about what is working in capitalism.
First of all, tell me, is there some society you know that doesn't run on greed?
And most importantly, what isn't?
We ought to do better by the people that get left behind. I don't think we should kill the capital system in the process.
As a journalist, of course, I want to talk about the future of journalism. I'm biased, but I think journalism matters. There's at least an argument that the threat of an expose forces everyone to be more honest.
The transmission of information and the formation of reputation are two essential elements for a market economy to work well. Information is collected and traveled through media, and reputation is influenced dramatically by media. So media in general, and not newspapers alone, are very important to the functioning of a market economy.
And if that's the case, then there's certainly an argument that we are all in big trouble. The New York Times just published a story entitled "How the Media Industry Keeps Losing the Future," which asked, can the idea of news survive in a digital world? A New Yorker headline was even more apocalyptic. Is the media prepared for an extinction-level event? Oof, ouch. It seems to me that the end of traditional media, which arguably began 25 years ago with the advent of the internet, has suddenly become clear. The New York Times and the Washington Post have eliminated hundreds of journalists between them, and here's the most stunning statistic to me from that New York Times piece. 1 out of 4 newspapers that existed in 2005 no longer does.
So this clearly describes the death of journalists, but not necessarily the end or the extinction of the media overall. In every business, technology changes the way we do things. So the question is not whether we need to protect the category of journalists, but whether the function of collecting and distributing information is still well perform in the economy, or even maybe better perform in the economy than it was before. And if not, how to fix that, not necessarily to find an employment to all the journalists, with all due respect.
And that is a very fair point, that there is a distinction between journalism and journalists, and journalism could be thriving even while journalists are no longer employed. But I think it's pretty inarguable that the business model for journalism is unworkable for the most part. And in simple terms, old school journalism wasn't funded by reader subscriptions. That was just a small piece of it. The bulk of the money came from advertisers. So once the classifieds moved to Craigslist and the advertising moved to internet companies, the funding model was broken. The New Yorker, in their piece calling this an extinction level event, ouch again, wrote, then came Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Pinterest, the social media charge. These platforms allowed users to get into the distribution game themselves. Suddenly, all it took to reach an audience was pasting a link into a box. A story that went viral on social media often reached more people than a publication's distribution networks could. In the short term, that offered gains, but in the long run, it created devastating advertising losses. Why stick your billboard at the end of Newsweek Lane when it could stand beside the exit on Facebook Highway that leads there and to so many other places? And so if the funding model is broken, I don't know what that means for high-quality journalism, let alone journalist jobs. Am I too focused on business model?
I think you are focused on business model, but I feel the pain. I don't want to sound like flippant. I feel the pain of journalists, and I'm not so sure how many listeners really understand. Who really killed the newspapers is not Google. It says Google contributed, but who really killed the newspaper was Craigslist. By destroying the classified ad market, which was a little monopoly niche in every town, destroy a big source of money for the local media. And I think that that's the major casualty, because I see alternative business model for international news, and our guest has founded a new sort of publication, so there is still a lot of entry in that sector. When it comes to local news, it's pretty much a desert.
I agree, but I also disagree, or I would amplify that. And I think it's not just local news. The magazine business, the print magazine business, is also profoundly troubled. And you can argue that maybe print magazines don't have a place, or magazines overall don't have a place in the new world going forward. And maybe that's consumer demand. I don't know. It seemed to me that there was a place for something that was separate from the onslaught of daily news, and that was just a thoughtful look at big issues, and that magazines have contributed a lot over time. But I suppose that's a debatable argument. The other part about local news that I think is not debatable is that a lot of the inspiration for big national stories came from local news. You'd sometimes read a New York Times story, and maybe in the third or fourth paragraph that kind of reluctantly acknowledge as first published in the Des Moines Register. But a lot of national reporters were getting their cues from great on-the-ground local reporting. If local news goes away, so does a chunk of what matters for national news, I think.
People have argued that, for example, the reason why the financial crisis in 2008 took so many people by surprise is because some of the distortions that led to the financial crisis were not covered by the local news. Generally, this stuff is covered by local news and then finally aggregates to a higher level. The same can be said for the opioid crisis. Even if there was some very good local reporting, I don't think it received enough attention. So I think that there is definitely a big issue on local news. I'm not so sure how this can be fixed, except through some models of financing by institutions or by fundraising or some nonprofit funding.
Yeah, there's an argument for sure that the state of affairs for many smaller media companies is about to get worse. That as Google rolls out AI search, then instead of sending people to outside websites, that it's going to answer queries within the Google interface, and then traffic from many places might dry up. But I do think it's complicated, because I want to blame everything on the broken business model on, yes, Craigslist and classified ads, but also, of course, on the big platform companies like Google and Meta. But it's complicated because consumers are, if consumers were still clamoring for and hankering after old school media, then the future would be brighter than it is. It wouldn't be perfect, but it would be brighter than it is, I think. Media has a consumer issue too.
Of course, because it's overstated that the medium is a message, but the change in medium does change also the way you present the message. And the younger generations are used to absorb news in a completely different way that you and I have learned to absorb news. And I think that's only normal. So again, the question is, are we starved for news or not? Because when you introduced the spinning jenny, there was a reduction in the number of weavers, but the amount of textile that was produced went up to the roof because productivity increased. So the question is, are the new technologies helping the collection and certification information in a way that is much more efficient? So we need less journalists, which is, of course, terrible for the journalists that are in transition, but is not necessarily a problem for democracy. Or are they really undermining the monitoring function that the press used to play? And then we do have a problem for democracy.
I am, of course, going to resist your widget analogy, basically widgets. I don't like the idea of journalists being thought of as widgets, but I actually think I'm right in this respect, because all yarn might be the same once it's produced, but all journalism isn't the same. And journalism, in the end, was always an editorial act. It wasn't as if, to some extent, everybody would write the same story, but there were a lot of stories that one publication would cover that another publication wouldn't cover, whether it was just because a reporter happened to notice something important or because of ideological differences. And so I don't think you can argue that journalism can be efficiently mass produced by one entity and then people are still getting their news, because it doesn't work that way.
As an Italian, I refuse the idea that all yarn is the same. There is very good quality one and there is bad quality one. So I don't think it's that different from journalism.
Anyway, we will stop arguing amongst ourselves, and we thought we would have Ben Smith here to answer some questions about the future of journalism. Ben reported for Politico, was a founding editor-in-chief at BuzzFeed News, and then did a stint as a columnist for the New York Times. Then he co-founded a company called Semafor. He's seen plenty in the media industry over the last few decades and thought about a lot of issues. So who better to have on our podcast? Welcome, Ben. Ben, I wanted to start with a big, broad question, which is how much of this was our fault? What was inevitable and what did we just screw up? This guy, Brian Morrissey, wrote in his newsletter, The Rebooting, recently that this is just what's happening in the media industry as a delayed reaction to the commercial internet itself. I don't know if anything could have been done differently. But at the same time, you've spoken about some of the mistakes that you think that BuzzFeed made. So maybe start there. What were mistakes and what was inevitable?
Thanks for having me on and for that broad question. So I think that there were things that were neither mistakes nor inevitable. There was a generation of media investors and executives who had made fortunes in cable. And the core dynamic of cable from in the 80s, the 90s, was that tech companies had laid, and infrastructure companies had laid wires in the ground and connected homes to literal cables. And those guys realized that to have people switch on and subscribe to the service that came through those cables, they'd need great content. And they paid tons of money to it. They paid most of their revenue to it. Cable is not the highest margin business in the world because they were shoveling money out the door to CNN, to MTV, to ESPN. And the cable Comcast did fine, but Comcast wasn't Google. And in fact, Viacom also did fine. And there was sort of a parity between the distribution company and the content company. And so when this new digital distribution came around and when these new networks, whether it was the search network of Google or the social networks of Facebook and Twitter and places like that came along, the same people, like literally the same people. Tom Freston, the founder of MTV, was the chairman of Vice. Ken Learer, who'd been central also to MTV's early running, was the chairman of BuzzFeed, said, okay, this is a similar situation. You have new distribution, and there are going to be companies that get good at making content for these pipes, as had been true of cable. And I actually think it was not inevitable that the platforms, found an incredibly high margin business in which they never paid for anything and relied solely on user generated content. That was, a business choice by them, in some ways a regulatory choice. Also, I think in retrospect, maybe a bad business choice. The Blue Facebook app was an incredibly profitable thing for 15 years, but I think will be gone in another 5 or 10. I don't think X is a great business. And I'm not sure that you'll look back and say the choice to rely on user-generated garbage positioned them well against Netflix. It was great for their margins.
Over the years, both Google and Facebook/Meta have made noises about the importance of supporting journalism. Do you think they believed it for a time? Kara Swisher had asked you if right now was the end of a marriage between social media and news. I guess it seems to me that if it was a marriage, it was a really bad one, but maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, were we their trophy wife or something?
Right, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that they were always supportive to the extent that it was essentially free or very cheap to buy off the media industry by providing partnerships here and there and throwing a little money their way. And that was a way to not have to sort of think about a universe in which 80% of your revenue goes to content, which was the old universe. But I think these sort of half-hearted initiatives have kind of run their course. On the distribution side, certainly news and journalism relied very heavily on social media for a decade. And I do think that was a real marriage and is now a real divorce.
And why, follow up on that a little bit, why now? Is it just because of Elon Musk's purchase of Twitter, or does that just underscore what happened, or is that a precipitating cause?
No, I think by the time Musk arrives, that era was basically over. And he kind of some ways gets blamed for stuff that was already happening. I mean, I think it's basically driven by consumers who, for a time, thought it was cool to have all of their friends talking about all sorts of interesting things in the same place. And then as politics became utterly, incredibly divisive in 2016, and that really became kind of a horror show and consumers didn't like it anymore. And so the platforms frantically tried to get all this divisive content that was driving people away off their platforms, but it was mostly too late and people are just moving to other forms of communication, whether it's, just passively watching short videos or group messaging in WhatsApp with smaller groups. But I think the notion that you want to get your news and connect with people every morning by walking out into an open air insane asylum with every other person in the world has lost its appeal and novelty.
You seem to me to have a somewhat dark view of human nature. You've said that you've always thought that one of the sort of misreadings of social media was that its problems were fundamentally technical rather than fundamentally about human nature. And I read that to say that journalists chasing traffic and social media companies using algorithms to amplify what we wanted to hear speaks maybe to who we are as people. It's not the fault of the journalists or of social media's algorithms. Is that fair? And I guess, is there any reason to believe that people care about the truth, about information, about struggling through something that isn't entertaining because they just think they should be informed?
I mean, I think some people do. But I think there was a real utopianism about, I certainly shared about social media, access to information, getting rid of filters and gatekeepers that is obviously not borne out. Not to say that, although I would sort of add as a sort of codicil to that it's not like it was so great before. The moment that preceded this birth of social media was the Iraq War. And, if you sort of do the counterfactual where Twitter exists during the Iraq War and regular Iraqis are photographing and streaming what's happening around them, we're not reliant on, what turned out to be lies from the Pentagon about just literally what's happening in the first few days in the aftermath of the war, say. I mean, that's a very powerful idea. And I think people, the big American mainstream organizations led by the New York Times sort of had discredited themselves. That wasn't imaginary or technical. And so I think the notion that people were interested in and open to something different had that social political component too.
So do you think that if newspapers started a paywall in 2000, the world would have been different? Could have done it?
Well, they would have had to be patient because the news business isn't that big or important. Netflix and Spotify represent much, much larger industries and things people care about more. And it sort of took Netflix and Spotify to train people to pay for content online. And then the news industry came in behind it. I mean, I think what you saw with the New York Times, they actually did wait long enough. They kind of burned all their furniture and held on until the ecosystem was ready. But this is where, again, I think you might know more about this than I do, but it's something I'm really interested in. Scandinavian media basically did that. German media to some degree did that. And I do think if you look now, a lot of the European media that went behind that never gave it away for free is in a stronger position than the American media.
If we come down to a world where the survivors are the New York Times and a few other small things around the edges, is that a good world or a bad world?
Oh, I think it's a terrible world, most of all for the New York Times in a way. I wrote a story today on the New York Times' handling of these allegations of sexual violence in Israel, which they didn't do a perfect job on. It's this strange situation where the New York Times' verdict on this thing that many other people are writing about has this wildly outsized import, and it's sort of incumbent on them to handle it with just exceptional care because of their outsized role in shaping American opinion. And that seems terrible and imbalanced and terrible for reporters at the New York Times, because you have this crazy level of scrutiny, although probably good for business of the New York Times.
I don't know if you know Andre Mir, who wrote this book called Post-Journalism. He claims that the subscription model is in fact a donscription model, a combination between donation and subscription. And so at the end of the day, the New York Times and so many other newspapers are victim of their own sort of customers, because they are not bought to inform, they're bought to provide a justification to ideology. And so they want more of the same ideology. And so even the journalists would like to sort of tell what they perceive as to be the truth. Sometimes they find a lot of opposition because they have ideologues who want sort of support for their faith.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's obviously a challenge with subscription businesses or any media business. I mean, the cable news is the subscription business in which you see that most purely. I mean, I think the Times is a more complicated story because it's a family-owned business, and the family doesn't like it, even though that is obviously kind of the logic of the subscription business in the short term, the family hates it. And so there's this deep internal tension around the direction.
Now, there is the business of news, and there is what I call the economics of news. And what is the difference between the two? The business is how you make money in news, and the economics is what role does the news business play in the overall economy. And maybe I'm an outsider, but what I think is the role that media play in society is to collect, select, and certify information. Are we better off along this dimension, or are we worse off, and why?
It depends who you are. In almost any field other than learning about a local area, you are better off. If you want information about markets, if you want information about the sanitation industry, if you want information about gossip in the economics profession, if you want investigations on national subjects of national political importance, there is better, higher quality information than there's ever been. Lots of people don't believe it, which is another problem. But the sort of, I would say, the general national American news landscape and broadly the business and trade reporting landscape are just richer and better than they've ever been. Unfortunately, most jobs in the American news industry have always been in local news. And local news in the United States actually is not this bad in Europe. And I think it's kind of an interesting question that I'm curious about the answer to as to why. But local news in the United States was an incredible business in the 20th century, just a huge cash machine of a business. And that has collapsed in a way that is attributable to this sort of classified and local advertising business, and is very hard to see how you fix it. And it's just sort of massive downward pressure on the journalism industry, on journalists and journalism. And the ecosystem also, the information ecosystem rested in a way, at least parts of it, on local. Is there a crime crisis in the United States? Like, well, I don't know. Like, you got to ask somebody who's covering crime in Indianapolis, and there are fewer people of that than there were. And you're left with Washington politicians yelling about it.
I actually buy your answer as far as we go to the collection and selection of information. I'm a little bit less certain about the certification. I think in the old days, and I'm not necessarily sort of say that they were great, but in the old days, there were some publications with enough rents that they didn't want to lose, that they were spending time actually making sure that when a fact was published was correct. Today, even the most prestigious newspapers, New York Times included, write a lot of stuff that is of dubious quality, and even when they make mistakes, they don't admit they made mistakes.
You are imagining an era that just never existed. Like, if you go, it was considered totally routine for the great newspaper columnists of the 20th century, Jimmy Breslin, to work with composite characters. The most famous journalist of the 20th century, he had a mobster he was always quoting, to the point that there were investigations opened up into this mobster, and then it turned out he was a fictional character. I think the internet wasn't around to check the facts, but no, newspapers were always full of lies and nonsense and propaganda. It's just that we now romanticize it.
So in economics, we talk about news as mostly a public good because they are not exclusionary. I can read the same news that you get, and so it's easy to misappropriate the news and distribute them. And so in general, the production of news tend to be subsidized. In the old days, it was subsidized by classified ads and in part by advertising. What subsidizes today the production of news?
I think it's become very niche. So there are people making really good money, not cross-subsidizing, selling directly news about technology, the technology industry, about the sanitation industry. There's a company that just sold for $500 million called Industry Dive that will report in great detail about narrow, deep industries. And that's not cross-subsidized. For general news, the subscription business is very limited in various ways. I think it's hard to build a huge business that way. And advertising remains really central, but mass advertising has lost a lot of its value. And the businesses that are successful, which I'd say Semafor, where I am now, is one of them. Puck is another. The Information is another. The sort of new wave of publishers. They're selling advertising successfully because they're reaching a very influential sort of high-end audience, which again, of course, poses its own, big picture problems about who provides mass information.
There's something that has bothered me about the rise of these very expensive subscription-only businesses and the rise of Substack, which is that news is becoming something that you have to pay for. And the more you pay for it, the more information you're able to get. Is that dangerous in a big picture way for society in that it's becoming an elite good?
Yeah, I would say that some of these, like Semafor, is free, but it's that the advertising model requires reaching this sort of high-end audience. And
yes.
Yeah, for sure. Yes. But obviously there was a power to this kind of mass, high quality news that kind of operated by consensus, whether it was big newspapers or big broadcast television outlets that have been, that's been going away as long as you and I have been in the business. But it's hard to know, is it cause or is it effect of this kind of new populism that rejects all sorts of things related to journalism and to institutions, but it's certainly intertwined with that.
How do you think about the purpose of and the funding of investigative journalism as a separate issue from the funding of day-to-day journalism or opinion journalism? Because one, the latter seems easier to me. I mean, people like Axios have built, entities like Axios have built big businesses off basically other people's reporting, even though they're doing a lot of their own now. But investigative journalism is different. It doesn't pan out. There's no way to hack it, right? You can spend 6 months on something and it turns out to be a disaster. Do you think differently about how to fund that or how to think about that going forward?
I mean, I think it's a great question. And when I was at BuzzFeed, we wildly overinvested in investigative journalism in retrospect because we loved it. And I remember once, some hedge fund guys came by BuzzFeed, and Jonah, the CEO, was talking to them, and they said, isn't investigative journalism expensive? Like, why do you do it? And he's like, well, I don't know. How much does like a good fund manager cost you? Like a really good one, not like one of the best, not just an okay fund manager. And they're like, I don't know, pay him. That guy had a good year. That person could take home $30-40 million. And Jonah's like, well, guess what a really good investigative journalist costs? And they were kind of guessing, and guessing high. And he was like, no, it's like $150,000, $200,000. And that person can, bring down one of those companies that your manager is betting on. I mean, so this is in fact like incredibly cheap and the highest leverage investment you can make. That doesn't quite pan out that way. And I do think that these successful big investigative teams and these long, as you say, projects that could pan out or not can really only exist in the context of a business with big margins that support them. And that's sort of where they grew up, and in these metro American newspapers that were incredible businesses. Or unless you're doing it in a nonprofit context, which is a whole other setup.
A former editor of Pro Market who went back to Italy had this idea of actually have the readers partly finance investigative journalists' inquiries. So they would put up 3 or 4 themes, then run kind of a fundraising campaign with the double benefits of raising some money and making it clear that he wasn't picking. So it was not a targeted investigative journalist, because unfortunately some of the investigative journalists is just an attempt to kill somebody. But this was outsource the decision, so outsource all the responsibility. What do you think about this potential model?
I mean, I've never really seen it work. I mean, because I do think that part of the challenge, as we were talking about with subscriptions, is they may not like what they find. Like if you asked Americans right now to finance an investigative journalism project, sort of undoubtedly they would want more investigations into what Jeffrey Epstein was really doing. And the reality is, like, all of the great investigative journalists in the U.S. have spent years on that one, and maybe there is more, but it sure is hard to get, and your charity subscription probably may not unearth meaningfully new stuff. And the great investigative stories are usually things you haven't thought of and no one is looking into, like Enron. At a sort of different way, ProPublica, which is sort of the great model investigative nonprofit. I know a guy who raised money for them would go around to rich people and would warn them, like, this is an unguided missile and it could land on you if you give money. And that is really important. I do think you see outlets of that model having huge impact. ProPublica has had some really large scale stories, love them or hate them, about the U.S. Supreme Court lately. I don't know. I think that model has worked in some places.
Yeah, but you're right. It is interesting. One of the things that has always bothered me, and it's bothered me for a long time, is this idea that if you finance investigative journalism, you're going to be able to make movies and you're going to get these big hits and you're going to get a piece that everybody reads, because it's not true. Somehow I feel like investigative journalism needs to be separated from the commitment to it needs to be separated from the results, because it's dangerous when it's not.
Yeah, or you're just selling people a bill of goods. The notion, I mean, that's one of the great fantasies, is that you're going to find a way to make money from journalism via making movies out of it. And it's this sort of fallacy that, like, some people have done that.
Yes.
And occasionally it works, but you can't reverse engineer it.
So can you tell us why you wanted to found a Semafor? What are the premises and what the opportunities that you saw in creating this new publication?
We thought that there's an opportunity to, in the immediate term, just try to build around the way media is structured right now, to say we're going to go out and, put on our hazmat gear and go out and read everything on the internet so you don't have to, and filter it for you. And then we're also going to build around individual journalists whose names who are transparent with their opinions and their views and their analysis, but also open to disagreement. That's sort of structurally how we're doing it. And then the other piece is just that news has always been global, but I think the American media has maybe never been as parochial as it is now and inward focused. And at the same time, the big stories, are fundamentally global. And it's hard to, you can't understand the rise of Donald Trump in a totally American context. and think of him as a totally unique global figure. He's obviously part of this huge wave. And so we sort of think that there's long-term an opportunity to build a sort of more global news organization.
I loved your analysis at the start about people coming out of cable and expecting the world to be the way it was in that universe. But even after that point, there have been no shortage of people who have been willing to make these big bets that they're going to figure out journalism, whether it's Mark Andreessen's firm giving BuzzFeed $50 million in cash, or you guys finding investors for Semafor, or even the story of The Messenger in some ways was an idealistic bet on the future of journalism. Why do people keep believing? Do they think they've figured out a better mousetrap, or do you think there's something else at work?
I think there are different categories. Like I think with BuzzFeed, it was sort of a classic Andreessen Horowitz bet, which is like, wow, if this thing can continue to scale the way it's scaling now, if its revenues can continue to grow like that, it'll be a huge business and exit at a great multiple. And maybe also secondarily tweak our enemies at the New York Times. But it was honestly before those guys were so poisoned against the mainstream press. I think for places like us, I do think these are investors who really are capitalists and believe that these things need, to succeed, need to be sustainable, great businesses. But I don't necessarily see it as the absolute highest ROI possible investment, and also are believers in the mission. And there's some combination of those things.
Now, to start Semafor, you, of course, had a bunch of people financing your enterprise. How do you keep them at bay?
It hasn't honestly come up, although you make very, very clear from the start that you have editorial independence. We wrote it into the terms of the investments. And we also raised money from a pretty large and diverse pool of people. There's no one close to being kind of a majority investor. But I think it's a reasonable question to ask. We disclosed our investors, which I think is important because at least you can sort of be held accountable publicly. But also I don't think there's some neat solution to that. I would say the neatest solution is to build a profitable business. And the most corruption you see is when people are desperate for money.
Semafor has been accused to be too close to the Chinese government and reporting about China. How do you see that relationship, and why I shouldn't be worried about it?
That's a very broad claim. We have no relationship with the Chinese government. I think we were accused of secretly taking Chinese money. I don't think anybody ever questioned our reporting, actually. We did not secretly take Chinese money. We considered and still consider doing a conference in China. We do a lot of events, and you can't do events in China without working with the communists, basically. And then there was a lot of attacks on us that we might be working with communists, but we don't have any relationship with the Chinese government. I should add, I thought you were going to say Tucker Carlson last week also accused us of being in cahoots with the CIA to spy on him because we had broken some story about him, and the only possible source for it was the CIA. So buyer beware.
Do you think of AI as a savior for journalism or as the final nail in the coffin? And I've been told that
That's so dramatic. Oh my God. Does it have to be one of those two?
Yes, it does. I've been told that I'm way too idealistic because, I like the New York Times suit against OpenAI, but I've also thought that, any journalistic entity that is breaking news that an AI has to have to provide answers will have a degree of value in this new universe. And maybe that provides a new funding model for journalism, and people have said, no, not enough people care. And so I don't know. Where do you come out on this?
I think AI is a very cool tool, and we have been using it for some very specific stuff around research. If you want to do really fast, high-volume research across 17 languages on what's being written about a news subject, it's super useful. I think that the kind of journalism that it's going to replace is the sort of is this kind of churny garbage that is gaming search engines that has very low value, and you're already, and there is more of it being produced. Yeah, so I think I think in a way, at least it is, at least right now, sort of raising the value of what was already the higher value stuff, which is kind of trusted news from a brand and a human being you can trust, and then also providing really basic tools, fancy type AI spell check like Grammarly is not going to destroy journalism, although it does mean that people hire fewer copy editors.
Speaking of AI, the New York Times has sued OpenAI for infringement of copyrights. How do you see that battle unfolding?
I mean, my impulse is that the law is sort of feels like it's on the, I'm not, as a feelings lawyer, law sort of feels like it's on the side of the AI companies, but who knows what a court rules or whether there's a big settlement before. Right now, the AI companies have sort of conceded in principle that they ought to pay something for training data, but there's a huge gap between what they think they should pay a few $1,000,000 and the big publishers thinks they should pay a few $1 billion. And it sort of comes down to this question. I think tech companies really believe that they are entitled to 80% margins and that's just, the nature of the universe, that platforms have enormous margins and don't pay for content because that's how it's been for the last generation of media. I don't think that's not a natural law. And you could imagine a legal regime where the people who supplied the information get 80% of the content and these guys scrape by on narrow margins. That would be great. We would all have lobster for lunch again.
Exactly. How's this, Les Bernardin, please? How's this for idealism that maybe big tech will figure out that you're right and that they've contributed to some of their own destruction or irrelevance by the path that they chose, and maybe they'll choose a different path going forward? What do you think?
I don't think so. That doesn't seem super likely to me. I don't know. I don't think people like to pay for things that they're used to getting for free.
So a last question from me, and you can tell I'm desperately hunting for reasons to be optimistic amid the death and destruction and terrible headlines like the New Yorker one. What other, in addition to Semafor, what other green shoots do you see in the media industry? What else gives you cause to be optimistic that there will be a future for news?
After social media, there's this enormous fragmentation. I think if you look at podcasts, actually, like this one, there's this strange fact that if you ask people their favorite podcast, the number one is Joe Rogan, this sort of center-right talk show guy, but he only has 4% of the market, and everything else is smaller. And it's this huge sort of middle tail of podcasts with 30,000, 40,000, 100,000 users. And it's, on one hand, for people who are used to this wide open, transparent social media ecosystem, a little scary because you have no idea what anybody else is talking about or listening to on the subway. And it could be totally different. But I do think people have sort of retreated into maybe quite partisan spaces, but also what are sometimes more sort of open, thoughtful, less divisive and safer after this kind of social media meltdown. And I find it's hard to cover, actually, as a media reporter. Fragmentation is really hard to cover when there's just lots of medium-sized things of equal influence. You're not sure what to write about. I don't know. It does feel less toxic than the previous iteration. So I guess I'm optimistic about podcasts like this one. There's a good, flattering, exit.
That's a good one. Thank you very much. And thank you for enduring some tough questions, but you did it with great style.
Thank you.
It's Bethany. I'm a huge fan. And Luigi, yeah, thanks for having me. My son is a junior at Chicago, so he was in economics, so he was very impressed that I was talking to you.
If you're enjoying the discussions we're having on this program, there's another University of Chicago Podcast Network show you should check out. It's called The Pie. Economists are always talking about the pie, how it grows and shrinks, how it's sliced, and who gets the biggest share. Join veteran NPR host Tess Vigland as she talks with leading economists about their cutting-edge research and the key events of the day. Hear how the economic pie is at the heart of issues like the aftermath of a global pandemic, jobs, energy policy, and so much more.
Bethany, you are the journalist. What surprised you of what Ben said?
So I think that he was as optimistic as he was his point about the quality of news that's out there today and the ability to find information. A lot of us in the news business would say it's all horrible because journalist jobs are going away, and the last 6 months, last year has been particularly brutal. And so I was surprised. I expected him to be more cynical and to be less, not really idealistic, but less optimistic about the future of the news business than he actually is. And maybe he has to be. He's part of a startup after all. But he does seem to see some real green shoots in how we're emerging from this past couple of decades of social media predominance. And of course, I can't help with some degree of schadenfreude liking his idea that maybe the era of social media is coming to an end and maybe Facebook has written its own ending. I thought that was a fascinating comment.
It was indeed, and I think you're right. He must be an optimist because otherwise he wouldn't have abandoned the New York Times to start his own enterprise with a lot of risk involved in it.
Although I was hoping that he would have a better answer or a happier answer about the future of investigative journalism, because I do think about the various business models that have been built in journalism. There are the various content models, not even really business models, but one content model has been around what BuzzFeed did, which was lists and entertainment and fun. But another content model that has really worked has been derivative. It's been people writing about other people's reporting and adding opinion and a dash of humor to it, but really in the end it's parasitical. It's relying on somebody else's underlying reporting, often that of the New York Times or another still funded publication. And so if it doesn't, in the end, even if it's been successful and even if it gets readers, it doesn't answer the existential question about the business because it's parasitical. And all of it leaves this question of how you fund investigative journalism aside. And I remember being really cynical in the teens when people would say, "Oh, well, it all becomes a movie, and we just want content so that it can become a podcast or a movie." And I thought to myself, as Ben and I talked about, half the time people don't care what results from an investigative journalism project. May be really important, but it's a movie it does not make. And so I think it made me think about how we began this conversation with the problems in local news. But I'd add that there's a problem with investigative journalism too. That nobody has figured that one out.
There is a problem, but there is also a new form of investigative journalism which is based on massive data leaks. If you think about the Panama Papers, for example, as being an enormous sort of investigative journalism, but was not generated by a lot of shoe leather effort, but by a massive dump of data. And newspapers have been good at creating international consortia to try to absorb this and process it and distribute it. It is much more efficient than it was. Now, I agree with you that it's more difficult to identify pedophile priests in Boston by using this kind of data. But I think that it is an advantage to what it was before.
Yeah, I agree. Maybe there's some good that comes out of the new era as well as some bad. The question I didn't think Ben answered was my first question, and it was a really big, broad question. But what did we in the news media do differently? Could we have done anything, or was this just inevitable? And he pointed out that everyone expected that the profit sharing would be somewhat equitable, and it just wasn't, whether because of regulation or whether because the platform companies' avarice, perhaps lack of ability to see the long term. I don't know. But I do. You asked too if we had set up paywalls in 2000, and he answered that. He answered that well, which is that the technology wasn't ready. But if the technology had been ready, would people have been willing to pay? And did we in the news media over the last 20 years, was it just that our sins of our mistakes and our biases and how ideological we can be were laid bare, and thus it always was? Or did we, in our desperation, our growing desperation to get revenues, chase clicks and therefore lose the trust of even people who would have continued to believe in us? Had people set up paywalls earlier, would there be more of a business left? Was there a way to push back on the platform companies before they became as powerful as they became? I don't know the answer. Maybe it's not even, maybe it's crazy to even spend any time thinking about it, because here we are, and it doesn't matter at this point. It is what it is.
No, but I think that in part he did answer. He said the situation could have been different. As he said, in other countries is different. I don't think that the technology was not necessarily there before. For example, in France, Mediapart started very early with a paywall, doing, by the way, investigative journalism in a country that does not have a lot of investigative journalists and has been quite successful. There was in a sense, silly insistence on the existing business model, not realizing earlier that if you want to produce something of quality, people have to pay for it. I think would have been helpful and probably would have had less of a casualties along the way. But it is true that in order to support a business model based on subscription, there are a lot of economies of scale. And so we're back to square one. The local news are the one really affected, because in the old days, there was a market for advertising in Buffalo that was different than the one in Chicago or in New York. So you could have a Buffalo Gazette supporting itself through that. And today, no reason to have a Buffalo Gazette separate from the New York Times.
And there is a larger question, too, even than for our democracy, for society, than the business model working. And this came out of my conversation with Ben. I don't know if it was his observation or mine, but I liked it, which is that there once was, when journalistic institutions made money and business made money and politicians had money, there was a balance of power. And when journalistic entities are struggling for survival and money is fraught and they have to do what they can to try to get money in the door and to try not to make enemies and to try not to have a lawsuit, it changes the balance of power in ways that are really dangerous. And so I did come away from this conversation thinking that not-for-profits cannot be the answer, because a not-for-profit will always be having to raise money among the wealthy and among the very people it's covering. You need a workable business model for the balance of power to be what it should be.
You're absolutely right. In fact, there was a very interesting paper in the early 2000s that was showing that if you look at the relationship between advertising and content in newspapers and magazines, and they were looking at mutual fund advertising and what they were talking about mutual funds, the newspapers with the most diversified advertising base, like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, were completely unaffected by the advertising. If you went to more specialized money magazine, all the advertising was basically mutual funds. So they couldn't really piss off a mutual fund by writing something negative. And so the content was much more affected. So the combination of the profitability and diversity of sources, I like his answer when I ask him, after all, you got financed by a bunch of people, probably to influence some of reporting. And he said, but the way I protect myself is by have a lot of them and relatively small, which I think is as good an answer as you could have given.
Yeah, and there's nothing different there really than, the old Fortune magazine was part of Time Inc., which was a publicly traded company, but we were funded by advertisers, but there were enough of them that nobody cared. There was a period where IBM wouldn't talk to reporters at Fortune and wouldn't advertise in Fortune magazine because we'd reported that Lou Gerstner cheated at golf. And as a result, he excommunicated Fortune. But no one thought twice about that. That was just the price you paid. We liked less that he didn't talk to, that IBM wouldn't talk to us than that they'd pulled their advertising money because we had so many of them. We had other places to go. It wasn't a fatal blow the way it might be today, or the way it might be for a more niche publication. Anyway, did you come out of this episode more or less optimistic about the future of journalism, and did it change your mind in any way on how much journalism matters?
Actually, before I answer that question, I want to ask, did he really cheat at golf?
The magazine reported it, and I guess that's what did in. It wasn't my story, but the old Fortune magazine was meticulously fact-checked, so I have to believe it was true. And it's so funny, for so many years I didn't get this at all until I asked a friend just recently who's an avid golfer, and he said that being accused of cheating at golf is like, I don't know, tantamount to something awful, but it's... I totally didn't get why anybody would care that much, but I guess they do.
But actually, at some point, I wanted to study whether you could predict the cheating behavior of executives by the way they were playing golf. Because if you look at, for example, Trump recorded score at golf, they are too good to be true. And, when you cheated once, you cheated every time. So I think that...
as is golf, golf is life, life is golf. There you go.
Anyway, on your more important question, I came out more optimistic. First of all, he destroyed the myth of the good old days. I oscillate whether I believe that the days in the past are good or not, depending on the day of the week and depending on what I read. So having an extra opinion saying that the old days were not so good is interesting, and is clearly optimistic about the future of media and even of journalism. So since he's on the trenches, I'm more optimistic myself.
I'm a little more optimistic, I think. I'm very worried about the future of local news and what that means, not just for local communities, but for national news. I'm still very worried about the future of investigative journalism, but I am really going to try to think about there being a difference between journalists and journalism. And how much people still have access to high quality information. And then that separate but linked societal issue about people wanting high quality information and wanting truth and wanting something other than entertainment. And that worries me too for the future of our society. But God, maybe thus it ever was. And maybe I'm too idealistic in thinking there was a different time where families sat around the table together with their newspapers instead of being on their phones looking at TikTok. Maybe that never happened. Maybe that never happened.
Capital Isn't is a podcast from the University of Chicago Podcast Network and the Stigler Center in collaboration with the Chicago Booth Review. Also check out promarket.org, a publication of the Stigler Center. The show is produced by me, Matt Hodap, and Lita Cesrain, with production assistance from Utsav Gandhi, Sebastian Burka, and Brooke Fox.